At a quiet bus stop on the edge of town, an elderly woman stands alone, lost in the cold, while passers-by rush past without seeing her. But when a 14-year-old boy, poor, hungry, and racing to make his last delivery, stops to help, he unknowingly changes both their lives forever. What begins as a small act of kindness turns into a powerful bond, revealing a hidden connection between a fading memory and a forgotten child. As the boy sacrifices his only shelter to get her home, he discovers that she's not just a lost old woman, she's someone who's been waiting for him in ways no one could imagine. This true life story is more than heartwarming. It's a story of dignity, of unseen strength, and of how love doesn't always come from blood, but from the choice to care. If you believe in inspirational journeys, black struggles, and stories of light that restore faith in humanity, then stay with us, because this is not just a bedtime story. This is the story someone out there needs to hear tonight. Don't scroll watch till the end and share it with someone who believes in powerful narratives and untold stories. It was the kind of cold that didn't just cut through coats, it settled in your bones and stayed there. The streets of Rosebridge were mostly empty this time of evening. The sun had already slipped beneath the horizon, leaving a dull orange glow smeared across the edges of the sky, just enough light to remind you the day had ended, but not enough to warm anything. The wind came in short, sharp bursts, tugging at street signs and trash can lids, sweeping dead leaves into corners. And through that wind, against the drag of winter itself, rode a boy on a bicycle too small for his growing legs and too old to be safe. Lionel Cooper pedaled harder, breath puffing in tight white clouds. His hands were red through the thinning gloves he wore, his hood half blown back, and the rusted gears of his bike groaned with every push. He was 14 years old, but moved like someone older, not just in the way he leaned into the ride, but in the way he looked at the world. Quiet, cautious, like someone who'd already been told too many times that things wouldn't go his way. His backpack was slung across his shoulders, the straps frayed. Inside was a brown paper bag, one last delivery, before he could call it a day. If he got it there before 8, Mr. Johnson at the corner store would give him the cash he needed to pay for the next week's rent. If not, well, he didn't have a backup plan. The place he stayed wasn't a home. It wasn't even really a room. It was a sectioned-off storage area behind the laundromat with a mattress on the floor and a space heater that only worked when the landlord remembered to plug it in. But it had a door, a lock, a thin blanket. And after sleeping in bus terminals and gas station restrooms during his worst weeks, Lionel had learned that even a bad roof was better than none. He glanced at the clock on his phone, 7:28. He had time, barely. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder, ignoring the way it dug into his collarbone, and kept pedaling. The sidewalk ahead was cracked and uneven, broken in places where tree roots had pushed the concrete upward. He'd ridden this stretch so many times that he didn't even have to look down anymore. Every turn, every pothole was burned into his muscle memory. This town hadn't changed since his mom died 3 years ago. If anything, it had grown meaner, colder, and no one had noticed a boy like Lionel fading into its shadows. At the intersection before the post office, he slowed down just enough to avoid a woman stepping off the curb with her arms full of grocery bags. She didn't look up, didn't thank him. Just gave a little side glance like his presence was something she'd rather not deal with, then crossed to the other side. He was used to that. The looks, the avoidance, the way people pretended not to see him until he got too close. Lionel didn't dress dirty. He didn't cause trouble, but his skin and his situation were enough to make him invisible in the ways that mattered, and too visible in the ways that didn't. As he neared the bus stop at the edge of town just before the road curved toward the hills, he saw her. An old woman stood alone beneath the flickering streetlight, wrapped in a long beige coat that sagged at the shoulders. Her hair was thin and silver, escaping from beneath a worn knit cap, and she clutched a leather handbag to her chest, like she wasn't sure if someone might try to take it or if she'd already lost something inside. Her lips moved as if she were speaking, but no sound carried over the wind. Lionel instinctively slowed. He wasn't planning to stop. He had a deadline, a delivery. A room that depended on this one job, but something in the way she turned slow, searching confused, made his legs pause. The woman looked at the passing cars one after another, her head bobbing with each set of headlights. Each time she leaned forward a little, as if she might wave someone down, then pulled back like she'd lost her nerve. Nobody else seemed to notice her. He coasted closer still on the opposite side of the street. From here, he could hear her muttering something. 12. Bus 12. Willow. Garden Lane. No Oak Hill. Her voice trembled like she was struggling to put the pieces of her own thoughts together. Lionel looked away. He had to keep going. It wasn't his business. She was probably just waiting for a ride. Someone would come. Maybe a son or a neighbor. He couldn't afford to get involved. Not now. Not when he was this close. But he kept looking back. His stomach tightened with something that wasn't quite guilt, but felt a lot like it. He could almost hear his mom's voice, soft, certain. If you ever see someone who looks lost, don't look away. We all need help sometimes. He braked. There was no plan in his head when he crossed the street. No speech prepared, just instinct. He pulled his bike up onto the sidewalk and walked it slowly beside him. The tires crackled on the ice-lined pavement. "Ma'am," he said gently, not wanting to scare her. "Are you okay?" She turned toward him, her eyes slightly clouded, her brows knitting together like she was trying to place him in a memory she couldn't quite reach. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she smiled, small, uncertain. "I'm waiting for my grandson. He was supposed to pick me up, but I think he forgot. Or maybe I forgot where he was supposed to meet me." Lionel glanced around. The buses didn't run this far out anymore. That line had been shut down last winter after the town cut funding. There was no bench here, just a signpost and a crumbling curb. "What's his name?" Lionel asked. She hesitated, her mouth opened, then closed again. I'm not sure." He nodded even though his chest tightened. The wind picked up again, tugging at his sleeves. He looked down at her feet. No gloves. Shoes more for a dinner party than this weather. She shouldn't have been out here alone. "Do you know where you live?" he asked softly. She clutched her bag a little tighter, confused. There's a hill. A big gate. It used to be white. Maybe still is. Oak something. Oak Hill. That name rang a bell. He'd done deliveries out there. Oak Hill Drive, the rich part of town way up in the hills. A good 2-hour bike ride, most of it uphill, and the cold would make it worse. He looked at the clock again, 7:39. If he stayed, he wouldn't make the delivery. If he didn't make the delivery, he wouldn't pay rent. If he didn't pay rent, the landlord would change the lock like he promised. No second chances. Lionel looked into her face again. There was something there. Not desperation. Trust. Quiet, blind trust given just because he'd stopped. He swallowed hard. There wasn't a decision to be made. Not really. "Okay," he said, adjusting the straps on his bike. "I think I know where that is." "I can take you." She blinked. "You don't need to. I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," he said, and he meant it, even if it would cost him everything. He wrapped his scarf around the seat to cushion her, took off his own jacket and draped it around her shoulders. Then he helped her onto the back, steadying her carefully. "Just hold on. We'll go slow." She gave a little laugh, fragile but warm. "You're very kind. What's your name, Lionel?" "Lionel," she repeated like she was trying it out for the first time. "That's a good name." He said nothing else, just pushed off and began pedaling. The streetlights flickered past them one by one as the town fell away behind them. He didn't look back. And just like that, Lionel Cooper gave up his shelter for the night to help someone he'd never met. No fanfare, no audience. Just one quiet decision that would change everything. He just didn't know it yet. The road out of town stretched longer than Lionel remembered. It wasn't just the distance, though. Oak Hill Drive was a good 5 miles from the bus stop, and most of it was uphill. It was the weight of the cold of the old woman behind him, of the decision he had made, knowing full well what it would cost him. Each push of the pedal sent a dull ache through his thighs, and each gust of wind stabbed through the layers he had left for himself after giving his jacket to her. The scarf wrapped around her shoulders kept her warmer than he was, but she was quiet now, hands clasped in her lap, her body rocking gently with the movement of the bike. Lionel could hear her humming something soft and shaky, like a lullaby without words. He didn't speak. He didn't want to break whatever small piece she'd found. Besides, if he opened his mouth now, he wasn't sure what would come out, a breath of complaint, or the beginnings of regret. But regret wasn't the right word. He didn't regret stopping, not even as the first icy flurries began to fall, brushing against his face like sandpaper. He regretted the world that made the choice so hard. That forced him to decide between helping someone and keeping a roof over his own head. That was the part that stung the most. They passed through the edge of town slowly. The streetlights were sparse out here, and the only sound was the faint hum of tires on frost-slick pavement. At one point, a pickup truck slowed behind them, headlights casting their long shadows forward. The truck edged close, then passed its driver, glaring down at them, as if to say something, but choosing instead to speed up and disappear into the dark. Lionel didn't look up. He knew that look. He had seen it more times than he could count, like his presence on a bike with an elderly white woman behind him needed to be explained. As they reached a narrow bridge over a frozen creek, the bike began to wobble. Lionel pulled to a stop, breath steaming hard, and helped her off gently. "Let's rest a minute," he said, voice raspy from the cold. She nodded without argument, sitting on the concrete ledge of the bridge, one hand resting on her purse, the other rubbing her temple slowly. "I used to walk these hills," she said suddenly, eyes searching the trees as if they might confirm it. "Long ago. My husband built our garden himself. He used to say the best soil is always the hardest to reach." "Funny, isn't it?" Lionel sat beside her, glancing at the sky, now darkening fast. "That's nice," he said, unsure what else to offer. She looked at him with a curious warmth. "You remind me of him a little. Not in the face, but in the way you don't say much." He didn't know how to respond to that. He kept his eyes on the frost-covered branches across the creek. "Are you hungry?" she asked, reaching into her bag. "I might have something." "No," Lionel said quickly. "I'm good. We'll get going again in a minute." As she shifted her coat, Lionel caught sight of a small pendant resting on her chest. It was silver oval-shaped, glinting under the faint light. Without thinking, he leaned closer. "What's that?" he asked, pointing gently. She looked down. "Oh, my necklace. My husband gave it to me." He reached forward, pausing for her nod, then turned it over. Engraved in delicate script were the words, "Hillary Foster, 48 Oak Hill Drive, Rosebridge." Lionel let out a slow breath. It was a long climb, but at least now he knew exactly where to go. He helped her back onto the bike, and they kept going, turning off the main road and onto the long drive that wound its way through the trees toward the hills. The incline was brutal. Lionel stood on the pedals to keep the momentum legs burning, hands numb, shoulders aching from holding the bike steady. By the time the wrought iron gates of Oak Hill came into view, he could barely feel his fingers. The gates were tall and old paint, chipping along the edges wrapped with ivy that had long since died for the season. A small keypad glowed faintly beside a call button. Lionel stopped and stared at it. He didn't have a code. He didn't even know if this was the right house. But before he could ask, the woman behind him lifted her necklace, a thin silver chain with a small oval pendant, and pressed it gently to the call button. A soft tone sounded, followed by a pause, then a sharp voice crackled from the speaker. "This is Farley. Who is this?" The woman didn't answer right away. Lionel leaned forward. "She's Hillary Foster," he said loud and clear. "She was lost at the bus stop. I brought her home." There was another pause. Then the gates creaked and began to swing open slowly. Lionel pushed the bike forward. The path curved up a final hill lined with old trees whose shadows loomed tall and still. The house came into view, 3 stories whitewashed brick windows glowing warmly against the cold night. It looked like something from a movie. Lionel had never been this close to a house like that. Not once. As they reached the front steps, a tall man in a housecoat stepped outside. His hair was silver, neatly combed, and his posture was rigid. He looked straight past Lionel and focused on the woman. "Miss Foster," he said, his voice tight. "Are you all right?" She nodded slowly, blinking like she was just now waking from a dream. "I went for a walk. Or a ride, I suppose." The man moved quickly to her side. "You've had us worried sick. We called the police, the hospitals. I'll notify Mr. Charles immediately." He turned to Lionel, then his eyes cool. "Thank you for bringing her. You can leave now." Lionel hesitated. He wasn't expecting a reward. He wasn't even sure what he'd expected, but the way the man looked at him, measured, dismissive, made his jaw tighten. "I just wanted to make sure she got home safe," he said, voice low but steady. Farley gave a single nod. "She's safe. Good night." Lionel helped Mrs. Foster off the bike. She turned to him, reaching out and squeezing his hand. "You're good, Lionel," she said softly. "I hope someone tells you that more often." He smiled just barely, then turned and rode off, the crunch of gravel beneath his tires the only sound for a long stretch. The trip back into town was quieter, slower, not because he was tired though he was, but because he was delaying the inevitable. The cold had deepened and the wind whipped harder now, cutting through his sleeves and slicing at his face. His knuckles were stiff, and every bump in the road felt like a jolt straight to the bone. By the time he reached the strip of buildings where his room was, his breath came in shivers. He parked the bike beside the rusted stairs and climbed them 2 at a time. The hallway was dark. He reached for the key in his pocket. Gone. Panic bloomed in his chest. He checked again. Jacket, pants, backpack. Nothing. He turned to the door, jiggled the knob. Locked. Then he saw it, his belongings shoved into a plastic bag and dropped by the door like trash. A crumpled towel, a cracked phone charger, a change of clothes, and a note taped just above the doorknob written in thick black marker. Past due. Lock changed. Lionel stood still, the wind slapping against his back, his hands shaking not from cold but from something deeper. He looked down at the bag, then back at the door. There was no one to call, no one to ask, no one to care. He picked up the bag and walked back down the steps. It was almost midnight when he turned onto the alley behind Johnson's Market. The lights were off, but a faint glow came from the back room. Lionel parked his bike quietly and knocked once on the side door. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened a crack, and Mr. Johnson's face appeared half asleep and annoyed. "You again," he said. Lionel just nodded, too tired to speak. Mr. Johnson looked him over. The red ears, the bag, the eyes. He sighed through his nose. "Storage room's dry," he muttered. "There's a cot in the corner. Don't touch the wine crates, and don't freeze to death on me." Lionel stepped inside, mumbling, "Thank you." The back room smelled like cardboard and oranges. He curled up on the cot, pulling the thin blanket around his shoulders. He didn't cry. He didn't even think. He just let his eyes close. And in that silence, with the hum of the refrigerator in the next room and the cold settling into the floor beneath him, Lionel finally slept. Not because he was safe, not because he was warm, but because for a few hours there was nowhere else to go. And even that felt like something. The sun rose cautiously fully over Rose Bridge the next morning, slipping through half-frozen clouds and casting a muted glow across the frost-laced windows of Oak Hill. Inside the estate, the world had returned to its usual stillness. The staff moved quietly through the halls, whispering updates and glancing at the closed door of the drawing room, where Hillary Foster sat alone, wide awake since before dawn. Her tea had gone cold on the table beside her. In her hands was a torn slip of paper, creased from being folded too many times, with a number scrawled in blue ink, Lionel's handwriting. She turned it over again and again, her mind replaying every detail of the night before, the way the boy had spoken, not loudly but clearly. How he had wrapped his only scarf around her shoulders without hesitation. How his eyes had watched the road ahead like he carried the weight of something older than 14. When Charles entered the room, his expression was composed as always, but something in his step quickened when he saw her sitting upright, alert. "You called for me, ma'am." Hillary looked up, eyes sharper than they had been in weeks. "Find him." Charles paused, unsure. "Who exactly, ma'am?" "The boy," she said firmly, holding out the note. "Lionel. He brought me home. I want to speak to him. Today." "Do we know where he lives?" She shook her head. "No. But he matters. You find the people who do matter." Charles took the paper and nodded. "I'll start right away." It didn't take long. Rosebridge was small, and though people didn't always remember names, they remembered actions. At the laundromat, Charles found the landlord who scoffed, but remembered the boy. Didn't pay rent. Locked him out 2 nights ago. At the corner store, a cashier remembered the delivery bike. He used to bring groceries. Polite kid, thin, real quiet. Finally, at Johnson's Market, Charles found what he needed. Mr. Johnson didn't say much at first, just looked Charles over, then nodded toward the back. "He's in the storeroom. Still asleep, I think." Charles stepped inside slowly. The room smelled faintly of citrus and cardboard. In the far corner, curled under a threadbare blanket on a folding cot, was Lionel. He looked smaller like that, the way children do when they're finally still. Charles waited until the boy stirred, then cleared his throat. "Lionel Cooper." Lionel sat up, blinking hard, instinctively, pulling the blanket closer. "My name is Charles. Miss Hillary Foster sent me. She asked me to find you." Lionel didn't respond right away. His mind was still fuzzy, caught between the chill of sleep and the echo of his own name. "She remembers everything," Charles continued. "She said you brought her home. She wants to thank you." There was a long silence. Then Lionel swung his legs over the side of the cot and stood. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said quietly. "I believe you," Charles replied. "But she still wants to see you." Lionel looked at Mr. Johnson, who stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. "Go," the older man said. "If anyone deserves to be seen, it's you." The ride back to Oak Hill was quiet. Charles didn't ask questions. Lionel didn't offer answers. But when the gates opened and the car pulled into the driveway, Lionel's fingers twitched slightly against his thigh. The house loomed tall and white, its windows blinking like slow eyes in the morning light. As the car stopped, the front door opened. Farley stood in the doorway. His face didn't move. No welcome, no nod. Just a glance at Lionel, then a brief step aside. Charles led Lionel inside. The warmth hit him immediately. Radiators humming floors polished the scent of fresh bread and lemon polish drifting through the air. It was too much. Too clean, too silent. He wanted to step back to disappear, but Charles motioned him forward. "She's waiting in the sunroom." Hillary was sitting in a high-backed chair near the window, the pendant still around her neck, her eyes watching the garden beyond. When she saw Lionel, her face lit with something real. Not dramatic, just real. "There you are," she said. Lionel stopped 2 steps from her. "I wasn't sure if you'd really remember," she smiled. "I remember everything. The ride, the cold, your silence. It meant more than you know." He nodded slowly. "I just wanted you to be safe." Hillary motioned to the seat across from her. "Please, sit." He sat still, unsure, still holding his backpack on his knees like a shield. "Charles spoke to Mr. Johnson," she said gently. "He told me about you. About how hard you've been working just to survive, about how you never ask for more than you need." Lionel's eyes dropped slightly. He didn't have to say anything. He didn't. Hillary said, her voice soft but firm. "But I asked, because if I was going to ask you to come here to live here, I needed to know what kind of young man you were, and now I do." She paused for a moment, letting the words settle before continuing. "I'd like you to stay here, for a while. We have rooms, plenty. It's warm, quiet." Lionel hesitated. "I'm not used to this. I don't want charity." Hillary leaned forward. "This isn't charity. It's recognition." He looked down. His fingers fidgeted with the frayed strap of his bag. "Just until I figure things out," he said finally. She smiled. Then it settled. Dinner was quiet. Charles sat with them along with Farley, who watched Lionel with a gaze that felt more like inventory than welcome. When Lionel dropped his fork, Farley was quick to pick it up with a napkin, handing it back without a word. The message was clear. After the meal, Hillary led Lionel to a guest room on the 2nd floor. The bed was made. The window looked out over the garden. There were books on the shelves and a desk with clean paper. "If you need anything," she said, "ask Charles." Lionel stood in the center of the room, still holding his bag. "Thank you," he said. She touched his shoulder gently. "Thank you, Lionel." When she left, Lionel sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. The sheets were crisp. The air smelled like lavender. He didn't unpack. He didn't lie down. He just sat there listening to the quiet, waiting to see if it would last. Not long after, Lionel settled into his new room, with the smell of fresh linen still unfamiliar, and the silence of safety, something he wasn't used to. Hillary began making arrangements for his return to school. She didn't ask whether he wanted to go, she simply assumed he should, and Lionel didn't object. There was something in the way she handled the paperwork, made the calls, and signed the forms that made it feel less like charity and more like a fact of life being restored. Charles drove him to the district office to submit re-enrollment documents, and Hillary personally wrote a letter verifying her legal guardianship. The school they picked wasn't just any school. It was a private preparatory academy just outside Rosebridge, well-funded, well-staffed, and full of students whose last names were attached to real estate signs and law firms. For Lionel, it was like walking into a world that wasn't meant for him. On his first day, Lionel wore a button-down shirt that was slightly too big tucked into his best pair of pants and the same worn-out sneakers he had patched himself 2 months ago. The shoes didn't match the polished dress code of the school, but no one said anything outright. They didn't have to. As he walked through the gleaming hallways, every polished tile underfoot reminded him he didn't belong. He noticed how other kids looked at each other, shoulders relaxed, heads high like they knew they were home. Lionel kept his eyes down, holding his backpack close, feeling the weight of invisible eyes on him at every turn. The homeroom teacher, a tall man with a tired voice, barely paused when Lionel walked in. He pointed toward an empty desk near the window and resumed taking attendance. Lionel slid into the seat, hoping it would swallow him. The girl in front of him glanced back, once offered a polite but distant smile, then turned away. The boy across the aisle gave him a long stare, the kind that wasn't aggressive but calculating, as if trying to figure out which category Lionel fit into. That boy was Baron Adams. Lionel had heard his name whispered in the hall during orientation honor student debate team captain from a family that donated half the school's new gym. The first few classes passed in a blur. Lionel listened but barely caught anything. The pace was faster than what he was used to. At his old public school, half the day was spent trying to keep classmates from fighting, and the other half trying to make sure the outdated textbooks didn't fall apart. Here, everything moved with precision, and everyone acted like they'd been preparing for college since they were 10. By lunchtime, Lionel was exhausted not from learning, but from pretending he wasn't 2 steps behind. He took his tray and sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria. The food was better than he expected, but he barely tasted it. Across the room, Barron sat surrounded by friends laughing. Occasionally their eyes flicked in Lionel's direction. He heard the laughter change tone, not louder, but tighter, sharper. One of them said something Lionel couldn't hear. Barron leaned forward smirking but didn't look away. Lionel kept chewing slowly, deliberately, telling himself it didn't matter. But it did. That day, as he picked at a lukewarm sandwich, someone slid into the seat across from him. He looked up and saw a girl with dark auburn hair tied into a loose ponytail, her uniform blazer perfectly crisp, but worn in like she'd made it her own. Her eyes were sharp, but not in a mean way. There was something knowing in them, like she'd already figured out half the room and didn't need permission to sit wherever she wanted. "You don't talk much," she said, unwrapping her own lunch. Lionel blinked. "You know me." She gave a small smile. "No, but I know what alone looks like. Name's Vivian." Vivian Burton was known around school for being smart, outspoken, and hard to impress. She wasn't one of the popular kids, not in the traditional sense, but people respected her. Some were a little afraid of her. She came from an old family, the kind that didn't show off, but didn't have to. Her mother was a lawyer. Her father taught literature at a nearby college. She liked to read in the library during lunch, but that day she chose to sit with Lionel. That alone said something. "I'm Lionel," he said. "I figured. You're the new kid from Oak Hill, right? The one who rides that creaky bike." He nodded slowly, unsure if she was mocking him. "Relax," she said, noticing. "I like creaky bikes." The next class was math. The teacher handed out a worksheet and asked the students to solve it silently. Lionel stared at the paper. The numbers looked familiar, but he couldn't remember the steps. He tried writing something, erased it, then stared at the clock. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then Barron leaned slightly across the aisle and muttered, "Just loud enough. Need help, new guy. Or did they forget to teach fractions wherever you're from?" A few students snickered. The teacher didn't hear. Lionel didn't respond. His jaw clenched. His pencil pressed harder into the paper. He circled a question but didn't answer it. When class ended, he stayed behind, asked the teacher for extra materials. The teacher raised an eyebrow, then nodded, handed him a few old worksheets. "We'll see how you do with these," he said, his tone more curious than supportive. Lionel walked home quietly that evening, backpack heavier with papers, his mind heavier still. At the dinner table, Hillary asked him about his day. He said it was fine. She didn't press. She just passed him another helping of roasted vegetables and asked if he needed more notebooks. Later that night, Lionel sat hunched over the math sheets, scribbling and erasing until his wrist hurt. He was 2 weeks behind on the syllabus, maybe more. But he didn't complain. He didn't even sigh. He just kept working. Over the next 2 weeks, things began to shift. Lionel stopped sitting alone at lunch, not because people welcomed him, but because Vivian started sitting with him, and no one wanted to argue with her. Barron didn't speak to him again, but Lionel could feel the tension every time he raised his hand in class. And he started raising it more often, not to show off, but because he had answers now. Real ones. One morning during math class, the teacher put up a challenge problem, something pulled from an old entrance exam at a university. He said it was optional extra credit. Most students stared at it, then went back to their assigned work. Lionel kept staring. Slowly, he started to write. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When he stood and handed in his paper, the teacher looked surprised. Later that day, the teacher stopped Lionel in the hallway. "That problem," he said, "very few students get it right. You did." Lionel nodded, unsure how to respond. The teacher added, "Where'd you learn to think like that?" Lionel replied softly, "My mom used to teach me when I was younger. She made numbers feel like puzzles, not problems." The teacher didn't say anything more, but for the first time, there was no trace of condescension in his tone. Lionel didn't tell anyone about it. Not Hillary, not Charles, not even Vivian. But that night, when he opened his math book, his hands felt steadier, and for once the silence around him didn't feel like pressure, it felt like potential. Under the pale yellow lights of the school hallway, Lionel walked slower than usual, his backpack heavier only in thought. It had been a few weeks since the day he solved the extra problem in math class, the one that surprised even the teacher. Since then, nothing monumental had changed, not in the way people greeted him, not in the way Baron Adams sneered when their eyes met, not in the way certain teachers still hesitated a second too long before calling on him, but under the surface something had shifted, subtle but steady. He had begun to realize that he could do the work not because someone handed him a shortcut, but because he earned it minute by minute, night after night. Each evening, Lionel continued to study in the corner of the sunroom Hillary had quietly transformed into a study space just for him. She never hovered, never quizzed him about his grades. She simply left a plate of fruit on the edge of the desk and walked away. Charles brought him supplies when needed: fresh notebooks, sharpened pencils, a better calculator, and sometimes nodded as he passed an unspoken sign of approval. Even Farley, once stiff and distrustful, had stopped glancing twice whenever Lionel came home late after tutoring hours. Though he hadn't softened visibly, Lionel noticed the man had stopped locking the front door exactly at 8. At school, Lionel's seat remained the same, but the energy around him grew denser. He began turning in his assignments early, asking more questions, and occasionally pointing out small errors in the practice materials the teacher distributed. One morning, as he walked into class, he noticed a few classmates glancing up from their desks, not with scorn, but with curiosity. No one said anything, but they noticed when he sat down. That was new. Baron, however, didn't look curious. He looked irritated. During one math period, the teacher asked a particularly tough question, the kind designed to stretch even the top students. Lionel raised his hand. He didn't rush. He spoke clearly, walked through the steps one by one. When he finished, there was a brief silence. The teacher nodded, satisfied. "That's correct," he said, his voice even. Baron muttered under his breath. The teacher ignored it. Lionel didn't. During lunch that day, Vivian caught up with Lionel outside the library. She had her tray in one hand and a book tucked under the other arm. "You know you made him look bad, right?" she said as they sat down. "Baron, he doesn't like being second to someone he thinks isn't even supposed to be here." Lionel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't do it to look smart." "I know," she said, popping a grape in her mouth. "That's why it matters." Vivian had become one of the few constants in Lionel's life. She never tried to help him in a way that made him feel like a project. She didn't overstep or ask questions that were too personal. She simply showed up at lunch in class, sometimes in the library, and treated him like someone whose presence she didn't need to justify. That more than anything, helped him stay grounded. One afternoon after school, Lionel stayed behind to finish a problem set, while the rest of the class emptied out. The room grew quieter as the bell faded. Just as he was packing up, Baron walked back in alone, hands in his pockets. He didn't speak right away. He stood near the back of the room, staring at the whiteboard. "That question you answered today," Baron said finally. "I solved it too. Just took me longer." Lionel turned slightly. "Okay. I've been in the top math group since 5th grade, Baron added, still not looking at him. "No one ever answered faster than me. Until now." Lionel zipped up his bag. "So what do you want me to say?" Baron shrugged, then smiled, but it wasn't warm. "Just letting you know I'm not going to pretend I like this. You showing up out of nowhere and acting like this school owes you a seat. I never said it owed me anything. You didn't have to," Baron replied and walked out. That night, Lionel said little at dinner. Hillary didn't press. She watched him with a gentle patience that had come to define their evening routine. After dessert, she joined him briefly in the sunroom, placing a new book on his desk, Advanced Algebra Concepts. "Charles said you might need this soon," she explained. "It's not required yet, but it could be helpful." Lionel looked at the cover, then at her. "Why are you doing all this for me?" She sat across from him. "Because I see the way you show up. Quietly. Consistently. That's worth investing in." He nodded once, then opened the book. She left without another word. Weeks passed. Lionel's name began appearing near the top of the class bulletin board. His quiz scores were no longer outliers. Teachers began to address him with less hesitation, sometimes even with expectation. The whispers in the hallway quieted. Baron grew colder, but no longer confrontational. Vivian remained the same sharp, loyal, quietly protective. Then one Friday afternoon, the math teacher passed back a test graded out of 100. Lionel looked down and saw 98 circled in red. A perfect score had only been achieved by one student, Baron. Lionel felt no jealousy. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar but firm. Not pride exactly, something steadier, something that said, "You're holding your ground." Vivian leaned over and whispered, "You're right there with him now." Lionel smiled just a little. "I'm not here to be him," he said. "I'm here to be better than I was yesterday." She nodded. "That's why you're winning." That weekend, Hillary invited him to sit in the garden with her. The weather was warming and the wind had lost its bite. She poured tea for both of them and sat quietly before speaking. "I saw the bulletin," she said. Lionel sipped carefully. "Yeah, you've come a long way, Lionel, but this isn't the end of anything. This is the beginning." He looked at her, unsure whether to thank her or question the weight of her words. "There will be more tests," she said gently, "some harder than any quiz or number, but you're building the strength now." Lionel nodded slowly. He didn't feel strong all the time, but he was beginning to understand that strength wasn't about never feeling lost. It was about continuing forward, even when no one guaranteed you'd find your way. And in that moment, beneath the soft rustle of the trees, Lionel believed quietly, but surely, that he would. The week of the school-wide math challenge arrived with little fanfare. Lionel received the announcement on a folded sheet of paper at the end of class. His name typed plainly beneath the words, "Selected participant," looked like it had been there all along. The teacher didn't make a speech, didn't pat him on the back. He simply handed Lionel the sheet and said, "We expect good things." That was it, but Lionel didn't need more. He carried the paper home folded twice, kept it in the pocket of his notebook, and said nothing to anyone, not even Vivian. He wasn't competing for applause, he was competing for proof. Not to others, but to himself. The night before the test, Hillary noticed Lionel reading at the table with his head propped on his hand, not because he was tired, but because he was focused in a way that made time fall away. She brought him tea without asking, placed it beside his elbow, and sat across from him. "Tomorrow's the big day," she said, her voice calm. Lionel looked up and nodded. "Yeah, you've prepared more than enough." "I hope so." She smiled gently. "Hope doesn't win tests. You've already done the work. Now you just show them what you know." He didn't answer, but when he returned to the same page a third time without absorbing it, she said, "Get some sleep, Lionel. The mind holds more when it rests." He obeyed not because she told him to, but because something in her voice made him trust that he would be fine. By morning, the house was quieter than usual. Charles had left early for errands, and Farley was outside trimming hedges. The table was set for two, but Hillary didn't come down. When 10 minutes passed, Lionel checked her room. The door was open, her bed was made, her coat was gone. He searched the sunroom, then the garden, then the greenhouse. Nothing. When he circled back inside, he found Farley already dialing a number, his expression tight. "She's not in the house," Farley said, trying to stay calm. And she didn't take her phone. Lionel froze. His heart pounded so hard he could barely hear. His throat tightened. Where would she go? He asked, but he wasn't really asking anyone. A cold fear spread from his chest down to his hands. He grabbed his shoes, his old scarf, and the keys to the bike Charles had helped repair last fall. The wind was stiff that morning, colder than usual for early spring. He pedaled hard down the long drive without a map and without telling anyone where he was going. He didn't need to. Something inside him was louder than panic. It wasn't instinct. It was memory. He remembered the first time he saw her at the bus stop, how she had stared into nothing, murmuring names of streets that didn't exist, how no one else saw her until she was already slipping away. And he remembered the bridge, the spot they'd rested when he first took her home. It was a quiet place. Still, far from the noise of town, close to the sound of water, his hands were stiff against the handlebars. The cold stung his eyes. Each turn of the wheel echoed the fear that maybe this time he was too late. Maybe she had wandered farther. Maybe she wouldn't remember him. Maybe. He turned the last corner. The bridge came into view. And there she was. Hillary sat on the low stone ledge wrapped in her beige coat, her hands folded in her lap. Her silver hair moved gently with the wind. She didn't look up when he approached. She was murmuring softly to herself. Lionel got off the bike slowly, his breath catching. "Mrs. Foster," he said gently, carefully. She turned toward him, her eyes wide but unfocused. Then her face changed into something softer, dreamier. She smiled. "There you are," she whispered. "My grandson. I knew you'd come. I've been waiting so long." Lionel felt something deep and painful rise in his throat. He crouched beside her and placed his hand over hers. "It's me, Lionel," she nodded slowly, her gaze drifting back toward the water. "You've always been so kind. You remind me of someone I loved very much." "I'm here," he said, voice thick. "I've got you." She leaned her head gently against his shoulder and closed her eyes for a moment. "I was afraid," she said, "but now I feel warm." Lionel blinked back the sting in his eyes. "Let's go home." He helped her to her feet, guided her back to the bike. She was light, her steps slow, but she held on to his arm with surprising certainty. They didn't speak on the ride back. Lionel pedaled with urgency, now his breath coming short and fast. Time pressed in around him. Every minute he spent returning her was a minute slipping away from the test. But he didn't hesitate. By the time they returned to the estate, Charles was pacing outside, and Farley stood by the door, looking paler than usual. When they saw Hillary, Charles rushed forward, but Lionel was already lifting her carefully off the bike. "She's fine," Lionel said quickly. "She just needed to remember something." Farley took her hand, nodded silently. Charles placed a firm hand on Lionel's shoulder. "They've delayed the start. You still have time." "Barely." Lionel didn't wait. He grabbed the clean shirt Charles held out, changed in the car, wiped his face with a towel, and jumped into the front seat. "Drive," he said. They reached the school building with less than 5 minutes to spare. Lionel sprinted inside, shoes echoing sharply down the halls, his heart pounding for a different reason now. A proctor met him at the door, wide-eyed. "You made it," she breathed. "Take a seat." He slipped into his chair, barely registering the gazes around him. Vivian sat 3 rows back, her brows furrowed with worry. Barron looked up from his test, lips pressed tight. Lionel didn't look at any of them. He picked up his pencil, looked down at the first page of questions, and breathed. Then he began. 2 days after the test, Lionel sat by the window in the sunroom, a book open in front of him, but unread. The events of that morning, the lost scarf, the frozen wind, Hillary's fragile voice calling him her grandson still echoed in his mind, not painfully, but with a quiet weight that refused to drift away. The house had returned to its usual rhythm, yet something about it felt changed. Even Farley moved more gently. Charles gave Lionel longer looks, not of suspicion or concern, but of consideration. They knew what he had done, though no one said much. When Monday came, so did the results. The bulletin board outside the main office was surrounded before first bell students gathering in tight huddles, pointing, whispering. Lionel didn't approach it right away. He went to his locker, changed his books, walked to class. It was Vivian who found him. She tapped his shoulder once, eyes lit up in a way that gave away everything before she spoke. "You did it," she said. "Top score. School-wide." Lionel blinked. "Are you sure your name's right there in bold print?" Barron came second, by 5 points. He didn't cheer, didn't smile wide. He only nodded once. "Thanks." In homeroom, the teacher paused before starting attendance. "Mr. Cooper," he said, glancing over his glasses. "Congratulations. You represented this class well." A few students clapped, quiet at first, then firmer. Barron didn't, but he didn't sneer either. The next few days passed in a strange mix of familiarity and shift. Lionel still took notes, still ate lunch in the same seat, but more students began nodding when they passed him. A girl from chemistry asked to borrow his notes. 2 juniors from the math club asked if he wanted to join. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. Vivian walked beside him more often now, still silent when needed, but quick to speak when it mattered. "You've changed how people see this place," she said once as they walked through the courtyard. "Not just because you're smart, because you made them pay attention." He shrugged. "I didn't do it for that." "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." One afternoon, Hillary was waiting in the parlor with an envelope in her hand. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes were calm but bright, with something unspoken. "This came for you," she said. Lionel opened it carefully. Inside was a formal letter from the regional academic committee. They had reviewed the scores from the school-wide math competition and invited him to apply for the state-level event. It wasn't just a test, it came with scholarship opportunities, recommendations, and the chance to be seen by people who could open doors. Hillary watched his face. "It's not just a letter, Lionel. It's the beginning of something real, something earned." He folded the letter neatly. "I don't know if I'm ready," she smiled softly. "That's how I knew you are." Vivian met him later that day with a gift, a slim dark blue pen inside a small case. "For the next test," she said, "write the future in your own ink." Lionel didn't say thank you, not right away. He held the pen for a moment, then said, "You're the only one who never made me feel like I had to prove anything." She smiled. "That's because I saw it before the rest did." That evening, the school paper published a feature titled "From Shadows to Spotlight, Lionel Cooper's Rise." It told the story without embellishment, just the facts. A quiet student who arrived under unusual circumstances, who had once slept in a storeroom behind Johnson's Market, and who had just won the school's highest math honor. The story ended with a quote from Lionel's interview, "I didn't want to be better than anyone else. I just wanted to be better than the kid I used to be." The article spread. Teachers discussed it in lounges. Parents asked questions during pickup. Even the principal mentioned it at the next assembly. "Excellence," he said, "doesn't come from comfort. It comes from conviction." A week later, Barron approached Lionel outside the library. His posture was less guarded, his voice flat. "You earned it," he said. "I don't like it, but I respect it." Lionel met his gaze without anger. "You don't have to like me. Just don't assume you know me." Barron gave a small nod and walked away. Back home, Hillary had been meeting quietly with Charles and her attorney. Papers were being drawn. A foundation was being named. One afternoon, she called Lionel into the study. "I want to tell you something before others do," she said. "I'm setting up a fund for students like you. Bright, overlooked, kids who need a door to open. I'm calling it the Willow Light Fund." Lionel felt the name land in his chest. She continued, "I want you to help shape it. Speak at schools, sit in on selection meetings. Not because you owe me, because you've walked the road they're still on." He nodded slowly. "Okay." Charles stepped in with a folder. "There's already interest from community leaders. They read the article. They want to meet the boy who made them look twice." Lionel took the folder, held it tightly. "Let them come. I'll be ready." The morning Lionel left for the state math competition, the sky over Rosebridge was streaked with dull gray and soft gold, like it couldn't decide what kind of day it wanted to be. The car was packed neatly. Charles handled that. And Hillary had risen early wearing a pressed jacket and holding a warm thermos she insisted Lionel take, even though the hotel had everything he'd need. Vivian arrived just before they pulled out, carrying a slim box wrapped in brown paper. She handed it to Lionel without fanfare. Inside was a vintage wristwatch, simple but elegant, the leather band worn just enough to feel like memory. She didn't say anything until after Lionel had strapped it on. Then she leaned in just enough for her voice to carry only to him. "This isn't for the test. It's for all the time you thought no one noticed." Lionel held her gaze, nodded once, then climbed into the car. Hillary smiled from the steps, her hand raised in a small wave. "Win or not," she called, "remember who you are." The state venue was larger than anything Lionel had walked into before. A long glass atrium floors that echoed registration tables lined with school banners from across the region. Competitors wore tailored blazers, designer backpacks, crisp name tags. The air buzzed, not with nervousness, but entitlement. Lionel, in his neatly ironed but clearly secondhand shirt, felt it the moment he stepped through the door. Not just the chill of the air conditioning, but the weight of eyes that skimmed and sized without words. As he waited in line to check in, a boy ahead of him turned slightly, eyebrows raised at Lionel's shoes scuffed practical clean, but lived in. "Didn't know this was open enrollment," he muttered, not loud but sharp enough. Lionel didn't flinch. He looked the boy in the eye and replied evenly, "Didn't know math had a dress code." The proctor at the table overheard and stifled a smile. Inside the main hall, rows of desks were set like a military grid. The test wouldn't begin for 30 minutes. Lionel sat quietly folding and unfolding the corner of his exam packet, mentally steadying his breath. He reviewed formulas in his head, but they floated like fog, not quite landing. Around him, students reviewed flashcards, exchanged last-minute tips, laughed too loudly. Lionel didn't join. He didn't retreat either. 10 minutes before the start, a small boy 2 rows over dropped his pencil twice, hands visibly shaking. Lionel recognized the look. It was the same one he'd worn his first day at Rosebridge. The boy fumbled again, blinking hard. Without a word, Lionel slid a spare pencil across the aisle. The boy looked up, startled. Lionel nodded once. "You've got this," he said. "Just that." The proctor announced the beginning. Timers clicked. Pencils scratched. For the first 20 minutes, Lionel felt underwater. The first problem read like a riddle, the second worse. His palms sweated. Then he remembered Hillary's voice. "You've already done the work. Now show them." His breathing leveled. He stopped racing the clock and started working with it. He found rhythm. 2 hours later, the tests were collected. Lionel sat back, exhausted but centered. As he walked out, one of the judges, a tall woman with silver glasses, watched him go. She said nothing, but made a quiet note on her clipboard. The awards were scheduled that evening in a separate hall. Lionel didn't change clothes. He didn't need to. When the results were announced, his name appeared first. Highest score. His table clapped. Vivian clapped hardest. Charles, standing at the back, allowed himself a smile. But then came something unexpected. The committee, the announcer said, has selected one student to receive this year's integrity recognition. This is not for the highest score, though he had it. Not for perfect answers, though many were. This is for the way he carried himself quietly, generously, and with grace. They called Lionel's name again. He didn't move right away. When he finally rose, the applause grew not thunderous, but solid, earned. As he reached the stage, the judge with silver glasses handed him a certificate and said softly, "You didn't just pass the test. You made the room better." The ride home was quiet. Vivian slept for part of it, head resting against the window. Charles drove with the calm of someone who had seen enough to trust the road. Lionel watched the trees blur past, watch in hand, certificate tucked into his jacket. Back at Oak Hill, Hillary was waiting with a cup of tea and a softness in her eyes that said she already knew. He showed her the awards, but she only looked at him. "I knew you'd bring something back," she said, "but it was never going to be paper." A few days later, she called him into the library. A file sat on the desk, cream-colored, stamped with legal letterhead. She handed it to him. "It's official," she said. "The Willow Light Fund is now established for young people with ability but no path. I've named you co-director." Lionel froze. "Me, you know better than anyone what it means to be seen late and lifted anyway," Charles added quietly. "We've already received inquiries from other districts. They read about the competition. They want to know who you are." Lionel stared at the file, then looked up. "Then let's make sure they hear it right." The air in Oak Hill had changed over the past few years, not just in season, but in rhythm. Lionel had grown taller, more composed, his voice deeper, but still quiet, steady. The house no longer felt like a place he was allowed to stay. It felt like the place he had helped keep alive. Hillary's health had declined gradually at first, then more noticeably. The moments of confusion came more often, and names slipped through the cracks of her memory like loose leaves in wind. She began calling Lionel Harry most days, her grandson, the one who had died years ago. At first, Lionel had gently corrected her. Then, eventually, he stopped trying. It wasn't dishonesty. It was comfort. He took care of her as she once did for him, reading to her in the evenings, helping her walk through the garden when her legs felt unsure, sitting beside her through stretches of silence, filled only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock. Vivian visited when she could, bringing small stories from the outside world and watching always gently as Lionel navigated this new kind of closeness with a patience beyond his years. One morning, Hillary didn't come to breakfast. Charles found her still asleep and let her rest longer. By midday, Lionel went up to check on her himself. She was awake, propped against pillows, eyes staring at the ceiling, like she was waiting for something. "Morning," Mrs. Foster, Lionel said, stepping in softly. She turned her head, slowly blinking. For a moment, her eyes didn't register him. Then they did. "There you are, Harry," she said, her voice thin but warm. "You always come when I need you." Lionel sat beside her bed and took her hand. "I'm here." She nodded, eyes closing for a long moment. "You've been so good to me," she whispered. "So steady, just like he was." He said nothing, just held her hand a little tighter. The room was still. The light coming through the window was soft and pale, like the sky was whispering too. She opened her eyes again, more alert this time. They met his, and for a second they were sharp present. Her fingers twitched in his, and her brow furrowed ever so slightly, like something was fighting its way to the surface. She stared at him, really looked at him, as if seeing his face for the very first time, or maybe finally remembering it. Her lips moved slow and trembling. "Lionel," she said, her voice breaking as she spoke it. Not uncertain, not accidental, but full of recognition, full of love. "Lionel, my sweet boy." He froze, breath caught in his chest. His heart pounded like it wanted to leap from his ribs. Tears filled her eyes, and she reached up with both hands, fragile as feathers, cupping his face with surprising steadiness. "You're not Harry. I know that now. But it never mattered. Not really." Her voice cracked again, but she went on. "You are my grandson. You became him. You became more. I see you. I always did." Lionel couldn't hold it in anymore. A sob escaped his throat, and he leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently to hers. He wept without shame, without sound. Only the trembling of his shoulders and the quiet shaking of her hands holding him like she was afraid to let go. You gave me more time than I thought I had left, she whispered, her own tears falling now. More meaning than I thought I deserved. I love you, Lionel choked out. I love you so much. She smiled faintly through her tears. I know, Lionel, and I love you, always. That night, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Hillary passed away. Peacefully. No struggle. Just an exhale that never returned. And Lionel stayed by her side until morning, holding the hand of the woman who had once been lost at a bus stop, but had become his home. The funeral was small. Just a few family friends, old neighbors, school faculty, and a line of students who had already benefited from the scholarship fund, each carrying a single white flower. Vivian stood beside Lionel the whole time, silent, steady. She didn't touch his hand until it trembled. When the service ended, Lionel stood alone before the small wooden marker. No grand headstone, no cold marble. Just her name, her birth and passing, and beneath it, she remembered the forgotten. The house didn't feel colder without her. It felt fuller. Every hallway echoed with her voice. Every teacup held her memory. But Lionel didn't grieve through stillness. He moved. He rewrote the fund's mission statement in plainer language so more applicants would understand it. He asked Vivian to help build an online platform for students across the county. He organized tutoring circles and partnered with local shelters to find teens who had aged out of the system like he almost had. One afternoon, as he sat in the garden Hillary had once tended with gloved hands and stubborn pride, Charles brought him a thin envelope. You've been invited to speak, Charles said, at the annual Education Reform Summit, national stage. Lionel looked at the envelope, then up at the sky. She'd hate the attention. Charles smiled. She'd hate it. And she'd show up anyway. Front row. The night before the event, Lionel rode his old bike into town. He didn't have to. He just needed to. He coasted past Johnson's Market, past the narrow alley where he used to sleep. He passed the bench by the bridge where he had found Hillary waiting both times. And finally he stopped at the bus stop, the one where everything began. The bench was still there. A little more rust. A little more lopsided. He sat quietly watching headlights pass. From his coat he pulled a folded card and placed it on the bench. The front read, "To the one who's waiting." Inside just one line, "Someone sees you." Then he stood, pulled his scarf tight, and rode home. Not because he had to, but because that's what you do when the light has been passed to you and you know it must be carried further. And somewhere beyond the porch, beyond the frost-covered hedges and the ever-silent gate, a wind passed through the trees, soft and warm. And for just a moment, Lionel looked up, not in fear, not in hope, but in knowing, because he had loved and been loved back, and that he now understood was the beginning of everything.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.